Next kinna we're going to do is the kinna on the Holocaust. In the white kinnas, it's an appendix. It's letter Ches in the appendix. It's the kinna by the Baba Rebbe. As you know, I talk every year about the importance of taking Tisha B'Av, which is a day of remembering all the tragedies of Klal Yisrael and spending some time, at least a little bit of time today, reading about the Holocaust, learning about somebody. And I always try before we do the kinna to highlight an individual. And I have to tell you, this year, my mother-in-law works for Project Witness. She was telling me for years to talk about this individual. My mother read a book, and that is the Kloisenberger Rebbe, Rebbe Yekasil Yehuda Halberstam. His story is it's unbelievable. You can't imagine what this man went through during the Holocaust. And as I said, of all of the people I talked about, as I read more and more, he probably had, and I don't think it's a stretch to say, the hardest experience from anyone that we previously discussed. His yichus was he's a descendant of the Sanzarav, the Divrei Chaim, and he became the Rav of the Transylvanian city, which is the border between Romania and Hungary, at the young age of 21. He was recognized very early on as a tremendous Talmidei Chachamim. He married and he had 11 children. In August 1940, Hungary, the leader of Hungary, allied himself philosophically with the Germans, and so he went along with them. But the Germans did not enter. However, Hungary decided, they started some small deportations at that time. His family was deported briefly. He was able to get with them, and then the local Jewish activists were able to get him back, him and his children and his wife, back to the city. During this time, between 1940 and 1944, Hungary, surprisingly, was not, the deportations did not happen from Hungary. About 750,000 Jews in Hungary, and Germany was focused on the surrounding areas. They didn't turn their attention until Eichmann in late 1940. So, I'm sorry, early 1944. So the Rebbe at that time, he continued to daven. He kept up his regular regiment of learning tefillos, and he even hid some illegal Jewish refugees. When in 1944, when the Germans come in, so Eichmann begins immediately, very efficiently. The Germans, it's unbelievable. They were geniuses at logistics, at production. That's how they were able to fight a war for as long as they were on two fronts, and at the same time use resources to perpetrate the Holocaust. And so they begin the deportations. The Rebbe himself obtained false papers, and he went to work in the labor camp, the Banya labor camp, in order to avoid deportation. On July 2nd, the Rebbetzin and 9 of the 11 children were deported to Auschwitz, and they were gassed immediately. Eventually, the Rebbe himself was also transported to Auschwitz, but he wasn't put in the Birkenau, in the crematorium side, but he was put in the labor division. The Rebbe, throughout, you read the stories, it's unbelievable. The Rebbe, throughout the time that he was in Auschwitz, he kept hidden. He had a 150-year-old pair of tefillin, and he kept it hidden with him, and he used to put it on, and people would come to the Rebbe, and he would put on tefillin. He tried, and he would comfort others, people who were broken, people who had lost their families. He was a parent to them while he himself was going through his own suffering. Initially, the Jewish kapos, who were the shoitrim, right, that the Germans in their cruelty put Jew against Jew. So these people resented him because he would be carrying on. He would daven wherever he was walking. He was thinking and learning. He was davening. And so they resented it, right? Well, what does Judaism, religion, belong in a place like this? But when they saw that he would get beat for not working on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and he would still retain that emunah and retain that fight, they grew to respect him. And he was selected for a group that eventually was transferred to Warsaw to clear out the rubble from the Warsaw ghetto. But the Rebbe was not in any shape to do it, because the Rebbe was makbid to wash his hands to Tilas Yadayim. And even if he would get a piece of bread, he would wait sometimes days before eating it to get a little bit. He would wait by the cement machine to see a little bit of water to wash his hands, and then he would eat. And he was makbid, he didn't eat tarfus. We'll talk about a story in a minute about that. So the fellow prisoners used to cover up and aid the Rebbe so that there wouldn't be any repercussions. The Soviet army advanced towards Warsaw. So the Germans lined up the whole group. They're going to shoot them. And at the last moment, right when they're lined up, they're ready to be shot, a German car comes racing in to tell the people in charge, the superiors, that there's a shortage of labor at Dachau, and they're going to transfer them to Dachau. The Rebbe endures a death march 70 miles in 3 days. You can't imagine. You stop to drink, stop to rest, you get beat, you get shot. And he endures it. Then they're transferred by train to Dachau. They're at a camp which is in the forests of Dachau. I think it was called Moldorf. And there were 12-hour shifts. Basically, 12 hours you work to carry this 100 pounds of cement. And obviously, the Rebbe couldn't handle it. So one of the people there bribes the German supervisor, and the Rebbe is reassigned to camp maintenance instead. As the war comes to an end, they start moving the Jews around. They have to try to cover up what they did. So they start moving the Jews around, train to train, on train from station to station. One day, at the end of April 1945, the train stops and a German comes on and says, "You're free." But the Rebbe, something wasn't right to him. So he said to the people around him, he said, "It's Erev Shabbos, where we're going to go already. Something doesn't seem right. Let's stay on the train." Most of the people were just anxious to get out of there. Maybe the Germans will change their mind. So the people left the train. The Germans start mowing them down with a machine gun at the same time that the Americans started bombing the Germans. And Nebuch, most of the people that got off the train died. The Rebbe survived. He stayed on the train with whoever was there with him through Shabbos. And then after Shabbos, they waited until finally the Americans arrived and they freed them. After the war is where the Rebbe really shone. Of course, in the concentration camps, he impacted the people. But you had survivors that were broken. They're shattered both in body and in spirit. And the imprisonment, what these people went through, there were wounds that couldn't fully heal. At that time, what did they need? What did a survivor need? He needed someone who was not just a leader, but a leader who went through, who could relate to what they went through. And so the Rebbe was able to be that light onto the darkness for these people. The Rebbe found out that his oldest son, Lipa, had survived the war. But by the time the news got to him, his son had just passed away. So he never passed away from a disease after. So when the Rebbe found out that his wife and 11 children had died, the Rebbe made the following statement, which he lived by. He said, "I've lost everything, but I have not lost Hashem." And that spirit, that attitude allowed the Rebbe to help so many survivors, yes, come back to Yiddishkeit, but also find life again, find a meaning, a reason to continue on living. Eventually, he married the sister-in-law of Rev Michal Dov Weissmandel, Naicherav, who we talked about a few years back. Weissmandel made the Shidduch. They had 7 children, and the Rebbitzin had passed away last April 2020 at the age of 96. I want to share with you one story that really touched me when I read it, and hopefully it'll have an impact on you as well. When the Rebbe reached Auschwitz, he took pains to tell his fellow prisoners that according to halacha, they were required to preserve their health and to eat whatever they were given. Since our enemy's intention is to destroy both our bodies and our souls, it's a mitzvah for us to do the opposite and preserve ourselves. Now is not the time to refrain from eating and endanger one's life. In other words, the Rebbe was paskening, you have to eat whatever they give you, treif or not. Despite the firm ruling for his inmates, the Rebbe himself refused to eat treif. He was determined not to defile his mouth with any morsel that was not kosher, no matter what the consequence. When the Rebbe's fellow inmates noticed this and began asking, what right does he have to endanger his own life? The Rebbe wouldn't answer them, but they threatened that if the Rebbe doesn't eat, they're also not going to eat. So the Rebbe was concerned. So he told them, give me some time to think about it. The Rebbe later realized the amazing event that took place, which served for him as a sign that heaven approved of his decision not to eat non-kosher food. He says, I reached Auschwitz on an Erev Shabbos about 10 o'clock in the morning. As soon as we entered the camp, a meat breakfast was served for those who had been selected for work. Everyone pushed to get some. My fellow Jews encouraged me to come and take food. I told them under no circumstances was I going to eat tarfas from the Rishayim who had taken everything from me. I fasted that entire Erev Shabbos. By evening, I was very hungry and weak. Next morning, Shabbos. I again hear the announcement for breakfast, and again, I did not go. When the barracks emptied, I was left alone. I burst out crying. Although I had undertaken to accept everything that happened to me with love, that afternoon I cried bitterly. Ribbana Shalom, I'm left with nothing. You have taken everything from me. My family is gone. I'm barefoot, and now I should eat treifas? I don't want to eat treif. As I sat there crying, a Jew enters the barracks, and he walks up to me. He says, are you the rabbi from Kloisenberg? The question frightened me. The murderers, meaning the Nazis, what they would do is they would single out the leaders, right? The rebbes, the leaders, for special, persecution. So he was nervous. He didn't want to answer. Another Jew came over and said, you have to come immediately. There's someone waiting for you by the door. I had no choice but to go to the doorway, even though I was afraid that a capo or an SS officer would be waiting there. At the door, I saw an older man, a Jew. He asked me, was the Kishner Rebbe your uncle? I was stunned. How did this man know about me here in Auschwitz? Yes, he was my uncle. Quickly, he gave me a loaf of bread and a small jar of jelly. I brought you something to eat so you can satisfy your hunger. In an instant, he vanished. I never saw him again. I saw clearly then that there is indeed a God in the world. My decision not to eat treif had been validated not only for me, but also for my fellow prisoners who had been pressuring me to eat the camp food. At that moment, I took upon myself not to eat treif food no matter what would happen, particularly since HaKadosh Baruch Hu had provided me with what to eat. I made kiddush on the loaf of bread and sat down to eat my Shabbos meal. The Rebbe said later on, during the entire year that I was imprisoned by the Nazis in Shemam, I didn't eat any non-kosher food, nor was I mechalel Shabbos, and I was protected by Shemayim. Not a single Russian knew who I was. Several times I was literally just a step from death, and I saw firsthand that Kadosh Baruch Hu protects those who observe his mitzvahs and study his Torah. Now, one Friday night, the Rebbe was giving a shiur, because we say in Kabbalah Shabbos, Mizmar Shir LaHashem Shechadash, Ki Neflois Asa, right? We're going to sing you a new song. Ki Neflois Asa, Hashem has done wonders. Hashiach La Yamina, his right hand saved me. Who's Rayakachai? Haiti Hashem Yeshuasai, Hashem made his salvation known. Leini Agayim Gilot Tzikasa. He revealed it to the nations. So an irreligious Jew was standing near the Rebbe and overheard him explaining these psukim. The Rebbe translated the verse into Yiddish and then gave an explanation. I didn't understand what he was saying, recalled the man, but it enraged me. Where was God's amazing feats? Where was his outstretched arm? Many years and life experiences later, however, I recalled the explanation that the Kloisenberger Rebbe had given, and the idea entered my mind. Wasn't that in and of itself an amazing feat? In the hell of Auschwitz, there was a Jew who was still faithful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and took strength in the amazing feats that he had promised to perform in the future. Says the survivor, this thought caused me late in life to return to our faith. And this was the Rebbe. The Rebbe embodied this strength, this superhuman strength, despite everything that he lost, to bring people back, to give them, like I said, a sense of living. Many survivors returned to Yiddishkeit, but even regular people who did not, the Rebbe was like a father to them. He established the Shiva Sheretz HaPleita. He established a hospital in Netanya where Kiryat Sanz is, that follows halacha. That's the motto of the hospital, and all this the Rebbe did because of his unpenetrable faith. The same emunah that we talked about at Avram Avinu of Nelchad Koi. It was the same faith that the Kloisenberger Rebbe had. So as we read the Kinnah itself, Zichron of Akainu Kol Yisrael. You should remember and mourn all of Klal Yisrael. Kolchem Yishama Barama. Your voices should be heard on high. Yishmida Germania Samani B'Meizama Melchama. The Germany has destroyed our nation in the days of the war. The Nisais Mishunas V'Aksaria is cruel and unusual deaths. Barabu Batsama, hunger and thirst. And if you ever read the hunger and the thirst that people went through, drove them mad. Don't forget for all generations until we see the final Nechama. Sarcasm of the Chiyosayim, the crying. As as people were taken in the cattle cars like sheep to the crematorium, let their cries reverberate in front of Hashem, the Karam Shema Yisrael, as they shouted Shema Yisrael, Rashi Yeshivas with Talmideim, he talks about the yeshivas, Al Sreifas Alfei Midrashas about the kinesios, for the shuls, for the Sefrei Torah, Zaku Shemai Ba'adam Al Alfei Ayaris Mitzrei Torah, cry out heaven and earth for the thousands of pounds and fortresses of Torah, Artzos Eiropo Kilaiseh, the European communities. And he ends off, Rachim al Shayim, Yisenu Habit Nabi Shamayim, that Hashem should have mercy on the nation, look down, Lamachanois HaKadoshim, Ki Esek Yotz Mitzrayim. 10 times the number of those who left Mitzrayim, 6 million, 10 times 600,000 left Mitzrayim. Koimei Beis Kachenu, you should reestablish the Beis Hamikdash, V'nakamenu B'Keflayim, redouble our Nechama, Raimimenu, lift us up, Avienu, L'Tzion, V'Yerushalayim.